Imagine, you're driving your car. It's dark. You aren't afraid, though. You have your navigator to guide you to your destination.
It's you, the road, and your navigator. You have your music on and you feel in control. You're driving. Someone is telling you where to go, and you follow the directions subconsciously. You change this radio station whenever you want to hear something new.
We do all of this without thinking. This is how we do things. We have our routine. We know what we're dependent on.
You turn your music up and take a drink of water. You've done this 1,000 times before.
You sing along at the top of your lungs and use your steering wheel for its obviously neglected purpose, a drum set. You've done this 1,000 times.
Your navigator says something, but you don't quite hear its muffled voice over ZZ Top, blaring through the speakers. But that's okay. You've done this 1,000 times before.
You look up and realize you aren't sure where you are. You try and use your surroundings to figure out where you are, but the darkness makes everything hard to make out. You've never done this before.
You pull over, turn down the radio, and start looking around. You've never done this before.
Suddenly it hits you. You're lost.
Alone.
Afraid.
Vulnerable.
Vulnerable. A word you've heard 1,000 times but never thought of as more than a word.
Vulnerability. A feeling you disregarded for years.
Where do you go? There's a road in front of you, another to the left, and another to the right. How do you know which one to pick?
You pretended that feeling wasn't there, that you were always in control.
You feel your nerves setting in, impeding confusion, quiet chaos.
Were you really in control? Did you call the shots? Did you deal the cards?
How do you know exactly what's going to happen? How do you know what's coming next?
Have you ever thought about the cards you've been dealt?
Have you ever stopped to look at your life as if it were a deck of cards?
You might look at your card and say, I've got a great hand. I wouldn't trade any of these cards.
And some of you might look at your cards and say, these are rough. I'm not proud of some of these. If I could just give some of these back to the dealer and get some new ones, then I'd be okay.
But these are the cards of life, your life. You can't trade these in for just new ones.
So we take the ugly cards, the ones that we aren't proud of, and we learn to shuffle them in with the prettier cards.
If you can hide the ugly cards behind your prettier cards, no one will have to know about them.
But deep down, we know the cards we've been dealt.
There's no escaping these cards. They define who you are. You're in all.
But what if we took a minute to stop and look at the cards we've been dealt? Where'd they came from? Was it life? Coincidence? Or was it God?
Some of you might say, why would an all-loving, merciful God give me these cards? If he really loved me, would he have given me these cards?
It's the cards that brought us pain, burdens, baggage. The cards we don't like to talk about. Cards of depression, rejection, words that linger in our mind and still cause us pain after years.
But there's also good cards. The times you scored your first touchdown, your first A on our report card, when you got your first car, the time you stood up for yourself.
These are the cards we find pride in, the cards we play over and over again. This is what we want other people to see of us, to show people that we have it all together.
But what does God think?
What if God were to choose the cards we show people?
What would these cards be? They'd be more than happy cards. They'd be pretty cards.
They'd be an array of the good and the bad, the easy and the hard.
As humans, we don't like harder cards in our life.
But we can't just hide behind the excuse that God has a purpose for us having these cards.
God wants to use the disappointing cards as the cards that fill us up with hope and joy.
To God, our cards aren't just a bunch of good and bad cards. They're just cards.
They're cards that bring him glory.
Cards that show us that it's his story, not our story.
Are we just going to pretend that we're dealing our own cards?
Are we going to hide behind the cards that are prettier than others?
But if we do this, aren't we missing out on the lessons we can learn from God?
From his view, we might have the best hand of cards imaginable.
But we don't always see what he sees, do we?
We find our safe places, the things we can depend on.
We learn to live in safety, independence.
Because let's be honest, no one wants to be vulnerable.
No one wants to feel alone.
No one wants to show people the darker sides of our lives.
We run away from our vulnerability.
We run away from God.
We try and swim towards the shore and find ourselves deeper than the waves.
We don't want to admit that we're broken. Lost.
Vulnerable.
We are called out upon the waters.
The great unknown.
Where feet may fail.
But it's His grace, God's grace, that saves us.
His grace abounds in the deepest waters.
His sovereign hand is our guide,
Our navigator.
and then it hits you.
This whole time you've been lost,
Looking around aimlessly,
fearing what you didn't know.
realizing you couldn't hide behind your excuses.
You never stopped to look at your navigator,
You'd think it'd be the first thing you look to when you're lost.
but instead you ran to fear.
Because in our darkest moments, we don't always run to God.
We run to what we think we find comfort in.
And then we stop and realize that we're thousands of miles from where He started, 1,000 miles from God.
When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When through the rivers, they won't sweep over you.
You may not understand what I'm doing now, but you will understand later.
Even if we strayed 1,000 miles from shore, God never once left our side. He was taking us deeper than our feet could ever wander.
Emotional.